This week on To the Contrary.
First, a new strategy for pro-life activists. Then, involved dads get a boost, but involved moms lag behind. Behind the headlines, the Fourth World Conference on Women 20 years later.
Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, legal wrangling over abortion.
A federal appeals court heard arguments this week about a hotly contested Texas law that could be the new frontier for the abortion rights debate. The law mandates a strict set of building codes for clinics requiring upgrades that could cost millions. Pro-life proponents say they're necessary to ensure the safety of women. But pro-choice groups say the clinics don't need the upgrades, can't afford to comply, and will close. Abortion rights groups claim their opponents are using an underhanded strategy to close clinics and limit access by pretending they're concerned about women's health. Fifth Circuit judges in New Orleans will decide if the law is constitutional.
So, Congresswoman Norton, is this the new strategy for pro-life groups by requiring clinics to upgrade and in effect closing them?
Pretty much, Bonnie. So far, the right has not been able to bring down a constitutional right. So they're trying to do all they can to keep women from exercising it.
No, this is trying to protect women. This is saying basically any facility that treats women or men, for that matter, medically ought to have to live by the same standards as everybody else. And many abortion clinics today have not had to do that.
Forcing abortion clinic closures is immoral. It has absolutely nothing to do with upgrades or health or safety, and it's an affront to women's basic human dignity.
I'm all for women's health and women being safe, but I come from a medical family that has many specialties, and I know our private clinics in my family, they've had to comply with guidelines that come down that have nothing to do but for patient safety.
But tell me how the kind of guidelines that a physician's office would have to follow are different from what's being put on abortion clinics in Texas.
Yeah, these regulations in Texas are absurd and they're dangerous. There are 41 clinics when this law first was passed. Now we're down to 17.
Didn't a similar law pass in Virginia?
It did.
And it was thrown out, right?
Well, actually, it's being amended, and I was actually at that State Board of Health meeting in Richmond recently where we discussed that. But in Texas, we went from 41 clinics, there's 17 today. There's only going to be 7 if the ambulatory surgical center requirement is upheld. So basically, it has nothing to do with patient safety.
No, but let me jump in.
No. There's a new study out from the University of California, San Francisco, that shows that abortion is overwhelmingly safe. We're talking about 0.25% of abortions. This is over 50,000 abortions had a major complication. The complication rates are much higher with getting your wisdom teeth removed. That's like 7%, to give a little context there. And
but
so
let me give a little
ridiculous.
context here, Bonnie. The reality is we make our veterinary clinics have more safety precautions than we do abortion clinics today, and that is wrong. And to suggest that no clinics in this country that perform abortions are not needing to have higher standards, look at the Kermit Gosnell Clinic in Pennsylvania that was shut down. He was put in prison because women died in his clinic, not because of just unusual things. Basic cleanliness standards were not upheld, and they weren't upheld, Bonnie, because nobody was making sure that they were. Why would we not ask them to follow the same cleanliness standards of any other
Well, if you're going to talk analogies, then you've really got to come to a real analogy. That was an abortionist that has been condemned by everybody. And it's
but
far
he got
from,
along for a long
typical,
time because nobody was checking
because nobody
his clinic.
was doing their job of making sure that the existing regulations were being enforced.
No, that was the problem. The regulations weren't being enforced.
What are the clinics objecting to? That they have to have wider hallways? That tell us what the problem
We're talking about oftentimes over $1 million in upgrades to comply, which is why these clinics are forced to close. You have to have these expansively wide hallways so that you could, basically drive a truck down the middle of them. It mandates
Why do we
things
require
like
those hallways in other clinics?
Drinking fountains.
Why do we require those hallways?
Okay, I just want to hear.
Let's stop here and take a deep breath and focus on what these clinics are actually being forced to comply with.
Okay, so wide hallways. What else?
Wide hallways, different. What's the word for it? The hangover thing over the front door.
The light.
Not the light. Excuse
Awnings.
Me. Awnings. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Awnings. I mean, so it's just expansive, ridiculous requirements. And the thing is, it has nothing to do with patient safety. The medical community has overwhelmingly stood up in the face of these regulations and said, these don't help improve patient safety at all. And I just need to go back and respond to something. I find it heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking that this is an issue of women's basic human dignity, and we talked about animals in comparison in veterinary clinics.
Yeah,
it's just
because you guys think that we ought to have higher standards for animals than we do women. When we have veterinary clinics that have higher standards in terms of medical and cleanliness, that is ridiculous.
You know, what happens in abortion clinics is usually not surgical. You go to a vet. They have to be equipped to do anything that the pet requires.
Going into a woman's body,
it's somebody surgical. On the side get their point out before you went in. You know, in other words, you have to be prepared to cut him open. They don't just bring him there to do a simple procedure, one time, very narrow procedure. So to compare what a full surgical clinic, where a full surgical clinic is necessary because of the nature of the procedures, to an abortion clinic, which normally is not surgical and is a very simple procedure, is to compare not just apples and oranges.
You're suggesting that only women who like are 4 weeks pregnant get abortions. As we know in this country, people up to 20 weeks get abortions, and there's plenty of surgical activity involved in that. I mean, look, nobody is forcing these clinics to shut down. The clinics themselves choose not to make the upgrade. And Planned Parenthood, a $1 million industry, can give them some bucks if they need it.
Genevieve. It seems beyond absurd for me for you to say that no one's forcing them to close down when the proponents of these regulations know that they don't have the millions of dollars to make those renovations.
Bonnie, if they need those millions of dollars, why can't Planned Parenthood, a multi-million-dollar industry which gets millions of dollars from the federal government every year, why can't it give money to these clinics if it's so concerned about it? I think women's health is more important than these million-dollar industry that Planned Parenthood runs.
This women's health is a canard, okay? I went to the Board of Health meeting down in Richmond, and who was standing up in favor of the clinic regulations in Virginia? There was one man who said to the group, he opened his statement with, I believe it's a man's job to make sure that a woman does the right thing. You had signs outside with men holding signs that say, abortion hurts women. They cloak their message in health and safety. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. In fact, these regulations make women less safe. Women have to drive in Texas, we're talking an 8-hour round trip to get an abortion if you're going from Rio Grande Valley up to San Antonio.
Well, the governor, the governor-elect Greg Abbott said, so let him go to a clinic in New Mexico.
Yeah, if you don't think that this is a cloak for closing down the centers, I wonder what you think of the requirement in some states for ultrasound and to be read to the woman. You really think that's about women's safety?
What I think is that I would have thought that this was an issue that, frankly, women of all sides could have come together on, because this has nothing to do with stopping abortion. As much as I would like to see abortion stop, I'll be very good. I'll be honest.
I just gave you an example where they also
I think ultrasounds are a good thing for women.
A forced ultrasound.
I don't think they have to be forced. Absolutely.
Well, then you're talking about a vaginal.
I understand that.
One at a time, please. You're talking about a vaginal ultrasound.
I am, which is forced because the woman has
Virginia, and I think that was ridiculous. But I do think
Texas. Texas already has that law.
A vaginal one? No, just regular ultrasound. Here's the deal. Ultrasounds are a great technique for people to see what's happening inside the womb. It's one reason I believe abortion has dropped in this country, is because we now can see in the womb and we see what's going on.
I want to get you in here.
I don't see what all the fuss is about. No problem. I come from a medical family. I tell you, my parents are going through the same thing right now in West Virginia. They own a private clinic. It's physical medicine and rehabilitation. They're not doing intrusive stuff. And those same codes are being slammed at them. Make your hallways bigger, change the awning, these same things. So I'm just kind of like, it's a democracy. These pro-life people have found a back way to do this if they wish. But I think other clinics across the nation are being given these same regulations, whatever specialty they're in.
Well, Planned Parenthood is very big, and it gets hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. To be fair, why can't they pay for these renovations for the 10 clinics in Texas that'll close?
Well, I want to be clear about something first. Planned Parenthood does get a good chunk of federal money, but none of that goes to abortion services. There is a lot of segregation in funding, so that's a misnomer to think those two things are connected. But a lot of the clinics that are being forced to close are the independent clinics that are, it's a mom and pop shop where it's just a couple people, a family-run business, and they're trying to help out patients as best they can. And so you can't have Planned Parenthood swooping in and saving everyone from this. And frankly, Planned Parenthood too, I think it's misleading to portray Planned Parenthood as like the Saks Fifth Avenue of healthcare. I mean, they're providing women's healthcare precisely because they're providing a lot of free, low-cost services to a lot of patients on the basis of need, and that's something that again, it's not like a ritzy place.
All right, let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay. From reproductive rights to working parents.
Involved fatherhood helps men's careers, while involved motherhood harms women's careers. Those, in part, are the findings of a study by a group of Boston professors to be published in the Academy of Management Perspectives. A study of nearly 1,000 working fathers find the more time men spend with their children on a typical day, the more satisfied they are with their jobs and loyal to their organizations. For men, increased parenting time translates into less work-family conflict. That's in stark contrast to the work-family dilemma women experience. Researchers believe while working fathers face ambiguity around their fathering identity, they don't feel that their work identities are threatened. Researchers credit management support for fathers.
So why this dichotomy? Why men spend more time doing childcare and they do better on the job, women get blamed for it?
Well, let's start out with the good news, right? Children do better when they have their father involved, or, I want to be acknowledging same-sex parents as well. Children do better just when two parents are involved, right? When everyone's involved. So that's a good thing.
And mothers, you would think, would do better as well because they have less time than to devote to child care, that they have to devote to child care, more to their work life.
Exactly. It's good for the family, it's good for the child, it's good for everyone. And so, that's the good news to start out with. And of course, it's also, now we see with this new study, that it's good for the father's career as well, that he's more committed to his workplace, that he's happier and has better job satisfaction. And that's a good thing for the bottom line. The issue is, how do we make this more fair for women, right? Because women who spend more time with their children actually experience more conflict in the workplace, which is unfortunate. One interesting thing to think about is what can we do in terms of paid parental leave and the support that we provide both to women and to men. Unfortunately, our country is way behind on this. We don't have paid parental leave for the vast majority of women in this country, but also if we promoted it for men, that helps men get invested early on.
Your thoughts?
Well, I do think, look, I think one reason that men are getting all the attention right now is because for so long women have just been doing this. They're the ones who always took off time to go to the games and take them to the doctor and all these other things. More guys are now doing that, and because you have a lot of guys in management, maybe they think, oh, I want to be able to do this too, right? But I think it ought to be treated fairly in the sense that...
I think men ought to just come right in and take over the women's movement because the last few months we've been doing all these stories about, men doing more child care and the He for She campaign at the United Nations have men, join in for gender justice for women, and here we go.
Here we go. Well, and it's funny. I work with a couple at Heritage. It's a man and woman who are married and happen to work even in the same department, and they take off. 2 days a week she goes and picks up the kids early. The other days he goes and picks them up early, and we don't. Melissa doesn't get in trouble, and because she's doing the same thing Rob's doing. They're both treated equally like that. But I do think it's a fairly new phenomenon, especially for guys.
Well, I think this is counterintuitive, and I love it. I love it that the men are getting so much out of the discovery, and this is what I think brings them happiness, that this really is a good thing. Remember, we're talking about the first generation of men. For women, they're still in the old school. And the old school says you forget about this being the 21st century, you're supposed to be at home, and they haven't quite moved up to the point that they can experience that satisfaction in part because for all the satisfaction that men have, they still are leaving most of the job to women at home. When she gets home, she's still doing a disproportionate amount of the work while he's been having a good time at the office, comes home, sits and plays with the children. She cleans the dishes. She does the washing. When it all gets to be equal, then everybody will be happy.
I think that day's long and far away. Sitting around the dinner table, I've had many private conversations with friends where, unfortunately, it isn't about women's empowerment. These guys are like, I'd love to stay home and play with the baby while you work. You want to work, right? So I'm going to stay home with the kids. It's more fun to me than working. So I think these discussions are just showing us that men are awakening. They're finding out that fatherhood is exciting and fun, and hey, they can maybe take a load off.
Let them do that for like more than probably a couple of weeks, and they'll decide they want to go back to the office.
They do.
Well, I love it that some of the Scandinavian countries which allow parental leave are saying both of you use it or you lose it.
Right, you have to. It's mandatory.
It's mandatory
and paid,
and that it has to be divided between men and women, because they apparently found out that they were reinforcing sexism because it was the women and only the women who were taking it, and they said, wait a minute, that's not really what we're about. So I think they have lessons for us to learn.
how long before? I mean, the fact that women haven't been having as easy a time, is that changing too? Is it going to get easier for them as more men take the time?
Well, absolutely. It's the more fathers you have involved, the better it is for mothers. And it's, again, same thing for same-sex couples. The more that you really have that true partnership and sharing, the better it's going to be for everyone. You know, I want to also acknowledge some of the conversations I have. So I have a 19-month-old daughter, and my husband is the person who changes her diapers whenever she wakes up in the middle of the night. What I find both wonderful and also really sad, I mean, I love it, of course, right? But what's really sad about that is whenever I share that with other people, they're like, oh, that's amazing, which goes back to what the Congresswoman just said, that it's women who are doing a lot of this hard grunt work side, and it's and not just the, you know, swooping in and doing the fun stuff like singing the songs and throwing the kid in the air and all the fun things like that.
All right. Behind the headlines, it's been 20 years since the Fourth World Conference on Women and its goal of women's empowerment. We sat down with the head of UN Women to find out more about what's transpired in those 2 decades and what's been learned for future progress.
We cannot depend on incremental progress. Post-2015 and Beijing+20, there is a moment for big and bolder step, standing on firm ground of knowledge and experience.
The year 1995, the city, Beijing, leaders from 189 countries came together to develop a comprehensive framework to promote gender equality and the empowerment of all women everywhere.
It is no longer acceptable to discuss women's rights as separate from human rights.
To commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, meetings and events are being held in cities across the globe. That, as activists and advocates assess progress on gender equality.
South Africa would be one of those countries where we have reached gender parity for girls and boys. In Latin America, a country like Ecuador, just the way they deliver services is very much gender responsive. You have the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Education, literally working together in order to make sure that when they deliver the services, they have got the best possible impact on the empowerment of girl children and women.
UN Women is also evaluating outstanding needs. Executive Director Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka says later UN initiatives, such as the Millennium Development Goals, may have left out an important issue.
A lot of the goals had strong relevance for women, given that sustainable impact in decreasing poverty depends on women. The goal that was meant to address gender equality only picked up 2 aspects around women. One was on education and the other was on equality, especially more representation. As you know, gender inequality is much more complex than that.
An ongoing concern across the globe is violence against women.
Violence is the most dehumanizing form of discrimination. When women are beaten up, sometimes it is because they are being demobilized from economic activity by a controlling partner. And to some extent, that violence means that women's health and mental and physical health is affected, and they're unable to work.
In some war-stricken countries, it's more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier.
In all of those hot spots of the world where there is violent conflict, you could almost say with your eyes closed that it is much worse for women. And sometimes what makes it worse is that it is not reported as such. The data and information about people who are dying and the experiences they are having is not always disaggregated.
UN Women launched the He for She campaign, enlisting men to be part of a solidarity movement for gender equality and against gender-based violence.
You actually want men out there in the community as decision makers, as brothers, as fathers, to actually take the responsibility in their private and public space to make things different. When we're talking about gender equality, women are also recognizing that where you have men who are in strategic position, it is their responsibility to use the power that they have.
Ngcuka emphasizes including men should not undermine women's effort, but generate a movement that can address larger-scale issues.
The advocacy that we need amongst men is relatively not resource-intensive. That is why women and men must stay engaged together, so that women can actually guide the struggle. After all, it is a women's struggle. Women must have a say about what it is that they would like the future to be.
So I was there 20 years ago, as was our executive producer, Carrie Stein. And
you guys don't look that old.
And there wasn't even any talk, all this talk about involving men like we've done earlier in the show. That didn't exist in '95. So from your perspective, though, not having been there, are we better off than, is the world better off? Women around the world better off?
Well, a lot of statistics and numbers would say that we are better off in terms of how many more women live today versus then, and in terms of nutrition and so forth. That said, we have a long, long way to go. And I think reaching out and getting more men to be involved in this is an important thing because, look, I mean, in so many of these countries, women are second-class citizens, many of the countries that we're talking about. And until men in those countries change their thinking about that, I don't think a lot of else things, it would be much harder for other things to change.
Well, you know, I agree because the two issues that most concern me, and there's been tremendous progress made on the easier issues. The two issues that most concern me, violence against women and preference for boy babies over girl babies in societies like China and India, which are disrupting the entire society. Nature never meant it that way. And I don't see progress on those two issues.
You don't see progress.
I don't see progress on those two issues.
I'm more optimistic. I'm excited about, hat tip to my generation, Gen Y, the millennials born between 1980 and 95. We are doing everything we can with these new media and social and technology tools that we have to raise our voices. People like Malala in Pakistan advocating for education. You know, violence in India, my ancestral home. I mean, these are things that are bringing to the surface of society because women are choosing not to stay quiet anymore, and they're using all the tools in the toolkit available.
That's fabulous, and I want to say too that in '95, when we were in Beijing, I felt like the U.S. was the leader on women's rights in the world, and those tables have turned.
Yeah,
because there are other countries that have had women presidents, prime ministers, many, and there were before Beijing. There have been many since Beijing. We're not close to a female president
It's
at
shameful.
this point. And we don't have, we're celebrating because we have 100 women in Congress out of, 435.
But all that said, Bonnie, women do
much
better in this country than many of the countries where women are actually president or the prime minister.
Like
so I think that it has to be
like Liberia. I mean,
yeah. I mean, my point. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have more women in Congress. But my point being is that just elected office is not the best measurement. It's how are women totally in that society able to do what they want to do?
And unfortunately, we're still living in an age right now where we are seeing dramatic new restrictions being adopted on women's rights in this country. And so we do still have a lot of problems here. And I think another thing when we're talking about global women's rights, we need to ratify the UN Convention on Women. The U.S. still hasn't done it.
Not going to happen anytime soon. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to-the-contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Thanks for raising that.
In the world, sorry, for the percentage of women in legislatures. Right. And we're behind Kenya, Indonesia. Right. Here, like,